All right. Hello, everybody. Um, Welcome to APUS History. This is your fourth to last class. And everything from now till the end is preparing for the exam, the AP exam, which is going to be May 15th. So I really want to push y'all to work your hardest on this review because it's preparing you for the exam that you can get college credit for. And they've made the exam substantially easier than it normally is, which means the chance of you getting college credit for this increases, which means that's not a class you have to pay for in college. So just to kind of explain how it would work, if you get a 4 or 5 on this exam, sometimes even a 3, when you go to college, they'll say that you have college credit. And then when they have your mandatory lower class history course, like lower classman history course, you won't have to take it because if you've already passed, you've already proven that you can get college credit. And then it just counts towards that. So regardless of whether your major's in history or not, or in some sort of political science or whatever you're planning on doing, most colleges will still make you take some lower class history course and an upper class history course. This exam would make it so you don't have to take the lower class history course if you pass it, which means you save probably $3,000 and you save some time to take other classes that you really want to take. So my biggest push for you is to take some ownership of your own learning and your own future and plan to do well on this exam. I'm going to help you by doing review stuff and making you do some critical thinking during the review. I'm going to help you with your DBQ. I was thinking about having quizzes to make sure you were actually listening and taking notes, but at this point, I think that's too much work on most of you, the ones who are doing the work you need to do. A little bit too much work on me, and at the end of the day, this is your own learning and your own exam. Cool. We're doing something a little different with the exam and the way we're taking review and notes. So I'm going to start with, this is your topic, period 3, period 4 review. Period 3 is this time, 1754 to 1800. Period 4 is 1800 to 1848. You're going to take notes in your normal Cornell Notes template. The thing that is changing is questions. So instead of writing your own questions, I will give you a question you need to answer. Does that make sense? This is always a good test to see if anyone's actually listening to me. Instead of writing your own questions, I will give you a question and you will answer it here. So let's get started. Your first question is, can you log into your College Board account? You will either answer yes over here or no. Don't answer no if you haven't tried. It is very, very simple for you to try and figure this out. You Google mycollegeboard.org login and it will take you to this page. Most of you guys had to log in and do this when you were registering for exams. Your username tends to be your student ID, your Google or your climb.kip account, something like that. Your password's normally your ID or your birthday. If you don't remember these things, you click forgot username or forgot password and you go through the prompts. If you really can't log in, you call College Board. Just like y'all, a lot of you had to do for ACT to change your name, to do all that stuff. You call them. Do not create a new account. You for sure have an account. All of you, except for maybe Vanessa and maybe Tracy and maybe Emma, have an account. So try it out. For you 3, if you don't have an account, email me. I don't know what to do. We'll figure something out. Cool. Let's get into the lecture then. So once you go to College Board, you figure out if you can log in or not. You're going to let me know yes or no. If you say no, you need to tell me why. Like, oh, I'm waiting for them to reset my password. Or, oh, I'm calling College Board. I'm on the phone with them right now. But this no does not give you off the hook. I cannot log in for you. You need to figure it out on your own. And you can. Y'all did this with the ACT. Y'all do this stuff all the time. Cool. Okay, starting period 3. So the first big thing with period 3 is it's all about the American Revolution, the colonies gaining independence from Great Britain and becoming what we know as the United States. It starts off with the French Indian War, which is from 1754 to 1763. So it's the first big war where there's actual conflict and violence on colonial territory, and colonists are actually fighting themselves. It's also the first time all the colonies had to sort of come together. So you have these southern Chesapeake colonies, and then you have these colonies up here, New England, Pennsylvania, all that stuff. They all had to come together and actually fight together. So you start to have this like colonial identity. They're learning how to fight in wars together. They're learning how to do this stuff. At the end of the French Indian War, it's actually a global war, the 7 Years' War, Great Britain wins, but because the war was so expensive, they now need to raise taxes. And that for that reason, they're more worried about colonies because they're worried about supporting colonies through security and providing colonies with troops, weapons, all that stuff to make sure that they can exist. This is where you start to see a rise in conflict between the colonies and Great Britain, which ultimately culminated into the American Revolution and a war for independence. Cool. So the rise in conflict. A term you need to know is salutary neglect. So British colonies were established in 1607 and moving onward. The sort of approach taken was salutary neglect, which is Great Britain had rules like you can't trade with Spain, you can't do this, you can't do that. But they didn't really enforce them. So colonists like kind of had the rules, but they're like, whatever. You know, like how sometimes it is at school, right? You're like, whatever, nobody cares anyway. And then that one person enforces them and everyone's like, you're the only person that cares, but whatever. The difference is after the French Indian War, the British needed to raise a lot of taxes, and so they actually had to enforce a lot of the things they were passing. So the first thing they passed is the Townshend Act, which raises taxes, basically said that the British Parliament, which is like the British government, can raise taxes whenever they need to. And then the Stamp Act also put a tax on anything that was paper related. You see the rise in conflict in this term, taxation without representation. So the colonists were like, wait. Number one, you're taxing us when you never had before, and now you're like forcing us to pay for things. That kind of stinks. But number two, we don't have any colonial representatives in Congress. So we have people, or in Parliament, so we have people all the way out across the Atlantic telling us what they need to pay taxes for, saying the taxes are for us. We have no idea what it is. We don't know how the money's being split up, all that stuff. So that's where you hear the term taxation without representation. And that's what starts the American independence conflict. That being said, they weren't quite ready to go to war yet because of taxes. You have some other pretty substantial acts that happen that increases the likelihood of war. So you have violence, like you have the Boston Tea Party where they're throwing over tea kind of as a protest. But then you have the Boston Massacre where there was violence because all the colonists were protesting, and then the British soldiers, the dudes in red, shot some of them. I think it was only 3. It's a massacre. How fascinating, right? Can I say? Which led to the Intolerable Acts, which basically said colonists cannot protest at all about what the British is doing. And that led to the development of the Continental Congress, which was like George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, all those cool founding fathers. They still weren't quite ready to go to war yet, but they were thinking, what can we do to kind of win our way with the taxes and get more freedom from Great Britain? That being said, it doesn't last for very long. We have an actual battle come out, the Battle of Lexington and Concord. That starts, and that leads to the Second Continental Congress, which decides we're probably going to have to go to war with Great Britain at this point and raise an army, and eventually, like, you know what, we're just going to declare independence. So the Declaration of Independence was written July 4th, 1776. That's a pretty big date, 1776, which starts the war. The Declaration of Independence is, one, a declaration of war against Great Britain, but two, it was to try to unite all of the colonists together to fight. If you think even about today, like thinking about Corona, right? If like the government says wear masks, you have people that are like, no, I'm not going to, right? You have factions of people who don't actually want to do, whether it's the majority or the minority saying something they should do, right? So the Declaration of Independence was a way to try to coerce everyone to kind of come together. I was also trying to say, like, hey, I know you're not white and I know you don't own land, and I know you're not a man, but you are part of this revolution. Here's why. So you see the rise of the Republican motherhood, where it's like the women had to help their men, had to help their sons get ready for independence and democracy and all that fun stuff. But at the end of the day, like, if you were a woman, if you were a slave, if you were a poor person with no land and you were fighting for independence, not much really changes for you right after the American Revolution. Yay, we won the war. Thank goodness, right? Oh, cool. I capitalized the articles just to make it really important. So the first government that the U.S. has is the Articles of Confederation. The founding fathers wanted a democracy, not a monarchy. So Great Britain has the king. Well, now they have a queen, but she doesn't really do much anymore. But back then they had the king, and the king controlled a lot. And then you have like the lords, and they're all wealthy, and they're the ones kind of running things. They want a democracy where people are voting for their representatives. They're electing their government, which means they're going to listen to their government once it's elected. The Articles of Confederation, though, was written as a response to them being scared of another monarchy. So it gave a lot of power to states like Georgia and South Carolina and Pennsylvania had a lot of power, right? And there was not much power for the federal government, which we know now is like Congress and the president and the Supreme Court. In fact, there was no president under the Articles of Confederation. There was a Congress, but they couldn't really do much. Like if they raised taxes, they couldn't enforce that taxes were actually paid. They couldn't regulate trade. They couldn't raise a military, all of that stuff. And so they're kind of just chilling with the Articles of Confederation, seeing what's happening. And then something happens where they're like, oh, wait, this won't work. Cool. It's called Shays Rebellion over shea butter. Not really. A bunch of people who fought in the revolution were promised like taxes and stuff to be paid back for their fighting. They didn't get that money because America was broke because we just got out of a war. So there was a rebellion, Shays Rebellion, where they were kind of like burning down banks, taking the money. And it happened in Massachusetts. And Massachusetts tried to get their National Guard out there. That didn't work. So Massachusetts was like, Pennsylvania, you're next to me. Can you help me out? And Pennsylvania was like, I don't know, man. I don't really want to. But they did anyway, and that didn't work. So then they're like pleading with all these other states. Like, Georgia, I know you're like really far from me, and it would probably take like 10 billion days for me to ride a horse from Georgia to Massachusetts. But, can you help us out? Point being, Shays Rebellion took a long time to stop because there was no central authority commanding a military or commanding people to stop it. And so that makes the founding fathers, the people who wrote all this stuff, decided our government, things like that, kind of take a step back and ask, like, okay, this didn't work. What are we going to do to, one, have a more powerful central government, but two, not give too much power to one person or a group of people, because that's not democracy. Questionable in today's world, I know, but whatever. So the new government is what we have now, which is the Constitution. If you remember, the Federalists and Anti-Federalists were fighting about the Constitution a lot and what it should have. But here's the outcome of some of their fights. So the Federalists really wanted a strong central government. And they wanted it to be based, they wanted like states with the most people should have more say. But if you live in like Georgia back then, no, there's not very many people. So it doesn't seem very fair. So you have the legislative branch, which is Congress, where you have the Senate, which is 2 per every state. So that's equal. And you have the House, which is based on population. So, for example, South Dakota probably has like 3 House representatives, whereas New York probably has like 20. I don't know if that's exact, but you know what I mean. You have the executive branch, which is the president, who enacts and enforces the laws that the legislative passes. And then you have the judicial branch, which is the Supreme Court, which reviews all of the laws. The Supreme Court's more important when you take AP Gov next year. Just going to name that. That's why I don't really spend much time on it. You also have this idea of federalism, which is that states and federal governments split power. Like they have equal power. There are some things the states regulate and control, and there are some things that the government regulates and control. That being said, defining federalism seems to be a common theme in the United States and throughout history in deciding who has more power. I would say even now federalism is becoming a thing when you think about coronavirus and who has more power or who should be taking charge of certain things. The Anti-Federalists thought, like, okay, maybe you're giving states power, but all of this is like a little bit much for me. How can I guarantee that I have my rights as an individual? So you have the passage of the Bill of Rights, which is the first 10 amendments, which basically declare your rights. For example, the First Amendment is your freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, which is basically saying I have the right, like the government cannot take away my right to protest. The government cannot take away my right to practice whatever religious belief I have as long as it doesn't infringe on others. The Second Amendment is the right to bear arms. The Third Amendment, soldiers can't come to your house, stuff like that. The Bill of Rights establishes that the government cannot take these things or prevent these things from happening for people. So it basically says these are your rights. Cool. Oh, and they were worried, the Anti-Federalists wanted this because they were worried about this being too big. But the thing with establishing rights is once these little suckers, the justices, start looking at the rights that people have, they can start determining if the laws are good or not. Which leads me to my second question you should be answering in the questions of your Cornell notes. Why is there a Bill of Rights? I'm going to keep going because you can pause the button yourself and answer that question. Cool. Last part of period 3 is you have the establishment of political parties. So it starts with the Federalists and Anti-Federalists. So Alexander Hamilton is a Federalist. He wrote a bunch of these Federalist papers. Thomas Jefferson is an Anti-Federalist. Either way, you see a party where one person is really into a large central government and one person is not really into a large central government. And so that's a pretty big deal as far as what we see today in the U.S., where you have two main political parties that have different interpretations of what the government should do. Sorry, my dog is biting herself. I don't know what's going on. So, to conclude, the American Revolution, the U.S. got its independence from Great Britain and became one of the first countries with a democracy. That being said, not everything was perfect. There is still conflict between states versus the federal government. The biggest one coming again is the Civil War, which, don't worry, is in the next review. You also have not equal opportunity being spread among everybody. In fact, democracy at that time meant only people who owned land, were white, and male could vote, right? So what am I saying? Who am I representing here? All right, the next period, period 4. I like this period more. Can you tell? I hate period 3. I mean, the American Revolution's all right, but whatever. Period 4 is the period 1800 to 1848. And it starts with the election age of 1800, which is the first peaceful transfer of power, meaning people went and voted for Thomas Jefferson, who was a different party member, and he took oath as president, and there was no combat and revolution and violence, which basically was like, oh, great, democracy works here. President Thomas Jefferson is interesting for a couple reasons. One, he was kind of weird about the government and not having it be too big, but he was responsible, which apparently could be unconstitutional, for purchasing the Louisiana Territory, which is all of this stuff here. The Louisiana Territory purchase is a big deal for a lot of reasons. The first reason being more land, right? So more people going out trying to discover the land, trying to take over the land, more access to resources, which means the economy grows. And then you see the Indian removal policies that will progress throughout the history of the United States. But essentially, Native American tribes living here are being transferred and moved elsewhere. Okay. You also start seeing in the 1800s, this is after, is regionalism. It starts with the War of 1812, which is essentially another war with Great Britain. But the idea of all the colonies becoming the United States and all of the United States sort of identifying that way with one another was not a thing. Instead, people identified it more with where they came from. So, for example, the War of 1812, you have a lot of these states up here supporting going to war, and a lot of these states are like, why would we go to war? That's like a waste of our time. The biggest example of this is the election of 1824, where you have 4 different candidates. Adams won because of the Electoral College, even though he didn't get the most popular vote. And you can see that people voted based on region. So Andrew Jackson, he was from Tennessee. People in that new territory that was established votes for him because that's their region. You have Adams, who's in New York, he's been there forever, New England kind of dude. Everyone's voting for him. So essentially, the regionalism starts to highlight this sort of fracture in the states, among the states. And this fracture goes beyond just like, hey, I identify as being from New York, cool, you're from Tennessee. But as far as like what they believe their government should do for them. Think about the economy, the geography, the society. Down here you have slavery, you have cotton, you have agriculture. Up here you don't have as much slavery, you have a lot of religious fanatics, and you have more factories. So regionalism really expands during this time and becomes to the point by 1861 where conflict is inevitable. Which leads me to your third question. What does regionalism suggest about the states being united? Again, you should go ahead and pause this because I'm just going to move on because I got things to do. This brings us to the market revolution, which again is mostly happening in those upper states, so Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, and New York City. And the market revolution is a transformation of the economy. So instead of going down the street to your cool little cobbler to get your cool little fancy cobbler shoes that take like 6 months to make, you can go to a store and buy them because we have big factories. We have canals transporting them everywhere. And you start to see the change in the economy. The biggest thing here is the implementation of a factory or the implementation of using people for like one set thing within there. They're using some machines, all that stuff, and working through that. You also see the development of different types of transportation. During this time, it's mostly canals and like steamboats and all that fun stuff. Most of this is happening in New England, the actual like factory production. And the biggest thing is textiles. In New England, you see a lot of women getting jobs. It's mostly like single women, immigrants, people who aren't married. But it is one of the few times where women are working economically for themselves. Once they get married, it kind of ends. The market revolution has a different impact in the South. The first impact is the rise in slavery. So textiles is cloth. Basically, because they need more cotton, you need more slaves to pick cotton, is the rationale that a lot of southern states and southern economies were using. So you see a rise in slavery happening in the South. You also see something interesting happening with women. So while over here, some immigrant women are working, getting some sort of economic independence, you see sort of a stricter sort of pull on that in the South, which is the cult of domesticity, which you definitely know, which essentially says women should be in the home, they're too fragile to work, they belong there, they need to like study God, they need to teach God to their families, all that fun stuff. Cool. I think I have another question for you. I do. Question 4. What were some outcomes of the market revolution? Go ahead and pause and answer that question in your questions. All right, and the last part of this, the Second Great Awakening. So the First Great Awakening was basically you go to hell no matter what. Not very woke if you ask me. The Second Great Awakening comes from the market revolution as a way to sort of revitalize church and get people to go back to church. And the message is one can save your own soul through hard work, repentance, and making yourself better. So if I've sinned, I apologize, and I go beyond just apologizing. I do specific things to make myself a better person. The Second Great Awakening inspired quite a few things. First, it inspired women, both married, not married, immigrant, non-immigrant, family, non-family, north, south, to be involved in these movements. In fact, women were very important in the Second Great Awakening and the reform movements I'm going to talk about because it was one of the few ways they were able to publicly express their views. Women couldn't vote, women couldn't run for office, so this was one of the ways for a woman to talk about what they view, how they view society and what changes they think need to happen. You also see some reform movements happening with education, so trying to provide public school for all, trying to make it easier for people to learn to read at home, and a lot of women sort of lead the charge on this. You see, Zephyr, can we not? You see reform in prisons and asylums. So instead of just locking someone up and not giving them a chance, bringing education to prison, and asylums trying to treat mental health even though they didn't really know what it was. And then you see some massive societal reform movements. For example, you have the temperance movement, which was mostly led by women, which is the movement to ban alcohol. You have the feminism movement. This is an image from Seneca Falls, where women are protesting their lack of rights as far as democracy and government and economic rights. For example, women couldn't buy houses, couldn't own property. If their husband died, the property wouldn't go to them. And then you see the biggest rise, which is abolition. The movement to end slavery, which, as we know, grows and grows and grows to the point where it can only end in violence. But all of this kind of stems from the second great awakening idea where one can make themselves better, but two, it is an open platform, pretty much mostly for women. I mean, men are out there, but men are always out there, you know what I mean? You have a lot of women going out and publicly speaking about what they think needs to change in society. Which leads me to my last question. What was the impact of the Second Great Awakening? So go ahead and pause that. Okay, a couple of quick things before I let you go. So on this side, I should see 5 answers. 5 answers. Not 5 questions, 5 answers. And then I should see your notes over here. And the last part of this is document analysis. Oh, I don't know why it says that. That's not very helpful. But we're practicing document analysis because that's a big way that you will get some points in your DBQ. These are the same key points as last time. So you're going to do the steps. I have a new prompt. You're going to write your quick thesis, and you're just choosing 3 documents to analyze, and you're only choosing one of these to analyze them with. It's a way for me to quickly check how you're doing with that and give you some feedback. All right, well, thanks for coming to my wonderful TED Talk. Sorry my dog was squeaking, and I will see you guys later.